Hello, everyone. This is Danny Dhaiphong. You are tuning in to the first Left Lens live stream of the month of June. I want to apologize in advance. There's actually some drilling going outside of my door. If you can hear it, I apologize. I hope that it ends soon. Not sure what's going on. You never know in apartment buildings here in New York City. But in any event, I know that with YouTube that there is some lag that uh, you may be just coming in. So I'll just repeat that again. Welcome. This is Danny Dhaiphong. You're tuning into the first Left Lens live stream of the month of June. This one will go a little bit over an hour, but probably nowhere close to an hour and a half because I do have a meeting at 2. So there is some drilling going on outside of my door. I apologize for that. I'm not sure what is going on, but I hope that it ends soon. So in any event, this live stream will be about, wow, it is really distracting. It may affect me a lot more than it affects you, but this is kind of what it's like to live in a New York City apartment. Please like the stream as you're coming on, subscribe to the channel, and make sure that you are hitting that notifications bell so that you are notified when I go live. And I have to say this, I know you're probably all hearing the drilling. I am so sorry about that, but I do have to say this. The month of May was really challenging in terms of my goal on Patreon. So I do want to ask if you can, please do subscribe at patreon.com/Danny Dhaiphong. That's patreon.com/Danny Dhaiphong. At whatever amount, it is appreciated. But my goal for the month was not met. And then there was like a mass exodus. People are really struggling right now, and that is incredibly frustrating. Not for me, but of course for all of you. And it really does impact me as well. So please do. Now I'm about over $200 shy per month. I was close to just $100 per month, but there was really an exodus of like $120 total. I mean, that could equal up something between 30 subscribers. So big losses. This is the nature of the gig economy of Patreon. It's really unfortunate, but anything you're able to provide is very much appreciated. So once again, as you're coming onto this stream, please do hit that like button, hit the notifications button. Make sure that you are subscribing to the channel, hit that notifications bell, and be sharing this all around as we begin. So please like the stream. And of course, the best way to support me is on Patreon. And as I said before, there's a lot of going backwards in Patreon before going forwards because of the nature of capitalism, as you all were saying in the chat. So hello, everyone. Hello. Hi, Lewis. Hi, Tom. Hi, Ida. Hi, Ware. Good to see you this afternoon. Hi, Holly. Hello, Big Teal. Good to see you all again. Thank you so much for being loyal viewers to this channel. And yeah, so keep liking the stream as you're coming on. Make sure you're boosting it. And yeah, we're going to have a good one today. I'm going to be on probably until around 1:30 p.m. There are only a few things I want to talk about. So as I said before, I was going to try to do things a little differently here, on at least on my solo streams. And one of the things I've come up with is, I don't think there will be the time for me to invest with columns and everything else to do real heavy theory work. But when it comes to the news stories, I think I'm going to try to choose certain stories or even articles and analysis that I can kind of comment on. There's a news story about Ukraine that I think is important to talk about. And then I want to talk about Venezuela and Venezuela's resilience and what it all means. I also have an announcement at the end about an event where you can catch the link in the description already if you want to check it out early. But I am going to describe it. I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to push for you all to register. But nonetheless, I think I'm going to do it like this, where I pick just a few things to talk about, maybe one, maybe two, and then I can expound on it, make the news kind of a political education moment, make these stories a political education moment. There's a lot of good independent analysis that is going on that doesn't always get a lot of the attention that it deserves. So I hope that it also serves to promote some of my favorite websites, some of my favorite writers, analysts, journalists, activists, etc. At least when I'm doing solo streams. And it's been really difficult to nab a guest for these streams. There's always something going on. I think it's partly my schedule and partly what's going on with others. So there's been a lot of solo work here, and I apologize for that because I really do like to interact with others, and it just hasn't worked out of late. But let's get started. So, first of all, I mean, you probably have heard about the shooting in Tulsa. It seems like there's a mass shooting in the United States almost every day. I think this is really linked to a lot of course, foundational roots of the United States' social, economic, and political system. But it's very interesting that this wave of mass shootings is happening during this Ukraine crisis, as it's called sometimes the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We can call it the U.S. proxy war on Russia through Ukraine. And what's interesting about this is that the militarization of Ukraine has intensified and escalated. And if we don't think that the militarization of the United States' foreign policy, that the escalation of the militarization of the United States' foreign policy has no impact on domestic politics, on consciousness, on ideology, on how people behave, then I think that we have a really sordid idea of how reality works. But if we think about reality from a dialectical perspective, from the perspective that really all things are related, whether they're contradictions or whether they're not, whether they're antagonistic contradictions or complementary or secondary or tertiary, or however far away we may think the relationship is, all things are really related, that we're all interconnected, that our environment is interconnected, that this political and economic system is interconnected in a web of social relationships, and we cannot exclude the militarization of everything in the United States' foreign policy as being the most dangerous expression of militarization of the U.S. imperialism's military arm, of its violent state apparatus. We can't exclude that from the conversation of mass shootings. But this isn't about mass shootings. I want to talk about how the United States, we could kind of perhaps use the metaphor that the United States is arming Ukraine in a manner that actually creates what is worse than a quote unquote mass shooting. It's arming it in a manner to essentially lay the foundations for permanent war, for war without end, for war that is ongoing, that is prolonged, and that really, at this point doesn't really have an end in sight. And so while Russia has been making incredible gains in the Donbass region, in collaboration with the republics, with the people of the Donbass region, we see that the overall war, the overall situation, the overall conflict between Ukraine and Russia is likely to last for a while. And that's because the Biden administration has been pouring gasoline onto this fire, has been continuing to arm Ukraine, escalating, providing more and more weaponry. And it began with Ukraine receiving all these old weapons. And I'm not a military expert, but all of these old weapons, this is a staple of actually of the arms trade, of how the United States actually does things. The United States usually gives a lot of older weapons, dumps them. It's dumped them in Taiwan, it's dumped them in other places, kind of dumps these overproduced older weapons that aren't really being used. And so they give them to proxies, to client states, etc., which generally can't be used, right? Or they're just so ineffective that if there was to be an actual open conflict, if there was to be a conflict where they needed to be used, it's likely that these governments, these militaries, wouldn't fare too well. And that was how the war uh, uh, in Ukraine started, right? Russia had a decisive advantage in terms of its military capabilities, but of late, that has changed a lot. And this doesn't mean that Russia is going to lose the war. I don't think that's possible because this was a special military operation. There were very specific goals, but it does mean that some of the goals may be arrested and or not achieved, right? Do we really foresee the demilitarization of Ukraine, Russia being able to facilitate that? Do we really see Russia being able to facilitate the denazification of Ukraine? It really isn't likely given the fact that the United States is now throwing modern weaponry to Ukraine. And these modern weapons, regardless of whether Ukraine has the capacity to use them or not, or use them correctly, they will be used and they will provide some help, if not immense help, to the capacity for Ukraine to continue on in this war without the possibility or without the real incentive to surrender or to come to some kind of agreement, to come to some kind of negotiations that can work for both sides. So I'm going to share this very short report in Common Dreams because this goes over the latest iteration of what the Biden administration is doing in Ukraine and how it is militarizing the situation, which really does point to the possibility of permanent war. And when there is permanent war, that means the threat of a potential escalation between the US and Russia is that much more likely. So let me zoom in a little bit for you guys. All right. So it's written in Common Dreams, published yesterday. Slippery slope just got a lot steeper. U.S. to send Ukraine advanced missiles as Russia holds nuclear drills. Peace advocates fear that Biden administration's high-tech arms shipments to Ukraine are increasing the likelihood of a full-scale conflict between the U.S. and Russia. So, peace advocates warned on Tuesday that the Biden administration's newly unveiled decision to arm Ukraine with advanced missile systems further heightens the risk of direct military conflict between the US and Russia, which accused the White House of, quote, adding fuel to the fire deliberately, end quote, as Moscow's deadly invasion of its neighbor rages on. This is, of course, the bias of the liberal, even the anti war left media. So, the slippery slope leading to direct military confrontation of the United States toward Russia just got a lot steeper, said Medea Benjamin, co-founder of group Code Pink, the anti-war group, wrote in response to the Biden administration's move, which was followed by news that Russian forces are holding nuclear drills northeast of Moscow on Wednesday. So here it is. The U.S.-made high-mobility artillery rocket system known as HIMARS will give Ukraine the capability to strike Russian targets roughly 50 miles away with powerful satellite-guided missiles. The rocket system, the most advanced weaponry that the United States has sent to Ukraine to date, is manufactured by Lockheed Martin, the world's largest military contractor. So this is an indication that this $40 billion package, we already knew that nearly 40% of it is going to military contractors. And here you see the fruits of that. The military contractors, the military industrial complex is winning out in this proxy war that the United States is waging toward Russia through Ukraine. This is really a test drive, I think, of the United States' military industrial complex for the entire region, because we know that what NATO is, right, this drive for NATO expansion is really just a is really just an escalation of a dynamic and a reality that's existed in the region for quite some time, which is post-Soviet Union falling 1991. The United States has essentially dumped its military hardware and weaponry, surrounded Russia along its border, and it has done that through NATO. And the subsumption, the consumption of these countries into NATO has only spelled more lucrative opportunities for the military industrial complex to make super profits. I mean, this is the relationship, this is the connection between political alliances, military alliances, and war profiteering. And war profiteering, as we all know, during the war on terror, massively increased, right? The US invasion of Iraq, the US invasion of Afghanistan, these wars opened the floodgates to massive increases in the military budget, which led to massive increase in subsidies to military contractors, which of course led to massive increases in the influence that these military contractors have abroad, their ability to send these kind of weapons, occupy countries through arms transfers and control of these governments through these military relationships, profiteering relationships, which ultimately, uh, I think, says a lot about the situation in Ukraine. I mean, this is the situation in Ukraine. And I wrote in a speech that I gave at an event that was held in Istanbul, not in Istanbul, Ankara, Turkey, that I'll be publishing later this week with the video. I said that these kind of relationships that the United States is forging with Ukraine is creating a dependency. So Ukraine is actually going to suffer a lot from this because these transfers are not free. This is lend-lease, right? So the United States is providing these weapons to Ukraine's government. Once this is quote unquote over, or whenever the United States demands, this lending will need to be paid back. That's what the United States will require. And how will the Ukraine pay it back? It will likely pay it back in the form of just immense austerity and sell-offs of assets, etc. Right, a real gutting of the economy. And the same goes for all of the economic loans, right? The arrangements that have been made by the IMF to Ukraine since 2014. All of this is going to have to be paid back. None of it is free. So to move on, it says, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the Pentagon has spent around $5.4 billion to buy more than 42,000 HIMARS rockets since 1998. U.S. President Joe Biden, who recently visited a Lockheed Martin facility in Alabama, took to the pages of the New York Times on Tuesday to explain his decision to supply Ukraine with high-tech weaponry, despite the risk that such arms could prolong the war and increase the already ghastly civilian death toll. Quote, said Biden, we will continue providing Ukraine with advanced weaponry, including Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, powerful military and precision rocket systems, radars, unmanned aerial vehicles, Mi-17 helicopters, and ammunition, Biden wrote, arguing that continued U.S. weapons shipments put Ukraine in the, quote, strongest possible position at the negotiating table, end quote. So this is the United States' definition of diplomacy, right? It really is not diplomacy at all. It's just waging war to force your hand so that you can get what you want. You can have everything that you want. And this is laughable to call this diplomacy or to say that this gives you a stronger hand at the negotiating table. I mean, there really is no negotiating table when you factor in these weapons being transferred to Ukraine or wherever the United States is waging these kind of wars, whether it's by proxy or whether it's through direct intervention. The negotiating table doesn't really exist when the United States is playing such a direct role in facilitating and escalating war, because this is the role that the United States plays. It's these weapons create this hegemonic ambition. It creates this hegemonic situation where the United States acts as the arbiter of what negotiating, what diplomacy, and ultimately what international law is. So what the United States is essentially saying, what Biden is saying, is that the only way to negotiate is by putting a gun to the head of the other side, by putting these weapons pointing right directly toward this other side that you're supposed to be, in this case Russia, negotiating with. It's absolutely laughable in my estimation, and also it's very dangerous, because this is how you manufacture consent for war, is that you render words like negotiations, like diplomacy, like international law, you render them meaningless. So so this article concludes, Moscow has repeatedly said that it views Western arms shipments to Ukraine as quote unquote legitimate targets, But Biden waved away the idea that such deliveries would lead to head-to-head military conflict between the U.S. and Russia. Quote, he said, "We do not seek a war between NATO and Russia," the president declared Tuesday. "As much as I disagree with Mr. Putin and find his actions an outrage, the United States will not try to bring an ouster about his ouster in Moscow. So long as the United States and our allies are not attacked, we will not directly engage in this conflict, either by sending American troops to fight in Ukraine or by attacking Russian forces," end quote. "We are not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. We do not want to prolong the war just to inflict pain on Russia," he added. Comments that appear to conflict with recent remarks by Pentagon Secretary Lloyd Austin, who said last month that the U.S. wants to, quote, "see Russia weaken to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine," end quote. "We want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability," end quote. That's what Lloyd Austin is saying. So this is, I mean, look at this is just emblematic of Joe Biden, the Biden administration's inconsistent rhetoric that is really meant to, I think, distract from the consistent policy. I mean, think about this. The Biden administration is saying we don't want war with Russia. We don't want to weaken Russia. We're not trying to bring about regime change in Russia. And then goes on to basically carry through all of the policies that suggest the exact opposite. Militarizing Ukraine, sending this high-tech weaponry to Ukraine directly. It speaks for itself. It says that the United States wants permanent war in Ukraine with Russia, that Ukraine will be a permanent proxy against Russia and will be militarized to the teeth in order to ensure that Russia is not able to really engage or enforce or attempt to have its security interests met, right? That's really what the Biden administration is doing. And then the political arm of the Biden administration, not the military arm, because the military arm is telling the whole truth there. Lloyd Austin is saying that the United States is trying to reduce Russia's capability of carrying out the special military operation and making sure that it can't do so again. That is a direct target. That is saying that the United States' policy is to weaken Russia militarily, which by extension is to weaken Russia politically. And I've said on the show, and I've proven it right here on this program, that the United States, whether it's through backing civil society, funding civil society groups, whether it's through militarization of the region, and whether it's through economic warfare, is trying to bring about the weakening of Russia's government and the delegitimization of Vladimir Putin's leadership. So Lloyd Austin is telling the truth, and it's the Biden administration, Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, right? The kind of diplomatic core of the United States' foreign policy establishment. They're the ones who are saying that, oh, actually, we are not trying to wage war on Russia. We're not trying to prolong a war as long as Russia doesn't attack our weapons, doesn't attack our allies, doesn't attack us, then we're fine. But how does that figure into a reality where the United States is sending these weapons to Ukraine's military, to all of the various armed groups that operate within Ukraine's military, and is actively training these groups on how to use them and on, uh, uh, you know, uh, how to carry out this war? I mean, the United States has been doing this for many years, has been training Ukraine's armed forces along with Canada and other Western countries. So ultimately, if Russia's aim is to demilitarize Ukraine, really by any means necessary at this point, how does it figure that the United States doesn't have a target on its back when it sends all of these high-tech weapons to Ukraine? I mean, it's very, very dicey and dangerous. So Medea Benjamin here is absolutely correct to raise fears about this because the line, right, the line of demarcation around this issue of whether this kind of militarization, this kind of escalation is going to bring about a direct confrontation between the US and Russia is very thin, right? I mean, it was thin in Syria. I mean, you remember Syria is still the war in Syria is still going on, but you all remember, right, when the so-called coalition of the willing was formed and it started to escalate, especially at the latter half of the Obama era and then into the Trump administration, 2017, 2018. You saw there were bombings of Syria, right, that occurred under Trump. And right, the line between how the Syrian army, the Syrian Arab army, was conducting its war to eliminate and eradicate terrorism, to eradicate those forces which were invading the country and wreaking havoc, and confronting and engaging with this coalition of the willing, which is backing and arming them and providing air support and all sorts of other things, was very thin, right? It was a very thin line. The concerns were there. And the concerns that Russia, when Russia stepped in 2015, that Russia would then come into confrontation with coalition, quote unquote, forces, including the United States, was also very likely to happen, right? And that's where the danger is in Ukraine, all the same. While the United States is not providing that air support right now, we know that it's providing on the ground logistical support, both covertly and overtly, and it has been doing so for many years. So, I mean, the United States, through escalating militarily in this way, is basically begging to get into a confrontation with Russia. And ultimately, this is the kind of objective that the US foreign policy establishment for many years has wanted to has wanted to flirt with for quite some time, right? Because the overall objective of US foreign policy, of US military policy at this time, is to weaken Russia and China, right? Great power competition, the Indo Pacific strategy. And while there isn't a direct strategy toward Russia, we know that the United States' foreign policy establishment, especially since the Obama administration, has looked upon Russia as a quote unquote enemy, has looked upon Russia as a quote unquote authoritarian country, and has looked upon Russia as a country that needs to be politically weakened, that needs to be economically weakened, and that needs to be surrounded militarily in order for the United States to maintain its hegemony and to push NATO expansion and further aggression in that region, right? And a lot of it is not even directed toward Russia. I think the downfall of Russia, of course, is a huge imperative and objective of US foreign policy. But maybe the biggest and maybe at the forefront of that is dividing Russia and Europe, right? The United States wants to capture the European market, meaning the United States wants to essentially cut off Europe from any other possible alternative to US economic medicine in the form of austerity. And that's what the United States' influence over the EU's decision to try to cut themselves off, I think, in a very futile manner up until this point, but nonetheless, the policy exists to cut themselves off from Russia's energy, is really an attempt of the United States to become more influential in Europe, even more influential in Europe policy wise, so that it can begin the process of capturing that market. Not necessarily offering anything, not necessarily saying, okay, now we're going to provide what Russia isn't, but by weakening Europe, the United States sees the possibility, especially as we talked about with Michael Hudson, right? Finance capital. Finance capital sees very lucrative opportunities should Europe become weaker and weaker and weaker to simply overrun the European order and overrun these countries and enact really bone chilling and crushing austerity measures to whatever is left of Europe's public and social sector, which has been under the gun of austerity for quite some time. But further US influence over Europe's foreign policy is only going to accelerate that process. And when we're talking about a country as significant as Russia, it's different than organizing countries to invade Iraq or Afghanistan. But when you're organizing Europe to basically do your bidding against Russia, the stakes are a lot higher and the economic consequences, as we have seen, are a lot higher. So the Biden administration is escalating this conflict. It's seeking permanent war in Ukraine toward Russia. It's all about Russia. It's all about weakening Russia. And the Biden administration is speaking out of two sides of its mouth. You have Lloyd Austin on the one hand saying, we're looking to reduce Russia's capabilities. We're looking to weaken Russia, while the Biden administration is saying, no, 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 no. This is an election year. We're not going to make any reference to any kind of aggression, right? We're not going to let anyone think that we are doing anything except promoting human rights and democracy and doing what is moral in the world, right? Helping out Ukraine from this evil authoritarianism that Russia is employing, right? From the what do they call it? A war without reason, right? A war without a cause, I've heard come out of the mouths of the Biden establishment. This is what this is what the Biden administration is trying to promote in an election season, to kind of wash its hands of accountability and try to show the U.S. population, which is weary of war. There's a huge, I mean, the Ukraine crisis and the U.S.'s role in it has been a huge reason why the Biden administration's approval ratings are going down. So you see these slight adjustments in rhetoric that the Biden administration is making, but it doesn't impact the policy. The policy remains the same: militarization, 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 weaken Russia, and move forward with the overall objective of strengthening NATO, whether by expanding it, Finland, Sweden, Ukraine, whatever, or whether it is just by increasing the existing influence of the NATO alliance as it is currently constituted, right? That is the overall objective, because the United States sees a stronger NATO alliance as the principal bulwark against Russia's sovereign development. And if NATO can become stronger, Russia, the thought process is Russia will be weaker. So there you have it. Joe Biden is escalating war, and this is going to be, I think, a theme. Should Biden win again in 2024, we can expect that to actually get worse. I think we saw the Obama administration's foreign policy get even more, I would say, belligerent, right, in the last half of his administration. So right now, all that is really restraining Joe Biden is the possibility of the Democrats being completely wiped off the map, the political map, in the midterm elections and then in the presidential elections. That's all that is restraining Joe Biden right now, because there's such a high level of dissatisfaction, especially regarding the economic situation. And so, even with that, you see the Biden administration pushing the envelope, continuing to pour so many resources into this war, and to essentially declare that this is going to be a permanent war. So we have to treat it like that, and we have to respond to Joe Biden uh, in kind. So with that said, welcome everyone who has joined the stream. Please do like the stream. Please do share it. Make sure that as you've come on, you've subscribed to this channel, you hit that notifications bell. I gotta say, the month of May was very rough toward my goal on Patreon. So if you are able, and if you are so kind to support all of my work, the streams, the articles, and everything I do in between, please do subscribe at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. You can find that link and other ways to support me in the description of this video. So moving on now, I want to talk about something that's a little more upbeat, because I haven't covered Latin America much on this program. I had a great stream with comrades Ben Norton and Carlos Martinez. I will definitely have to get them back together soon. Actually, Carlos, I'll probably try to have him on soon. He wrote a great article for the Global Times that I won't be going over today. I'm going to kind of focus on Venezuela right now, but he wrote a great article about the Summit for the Americas that the Biden administration is holding very soon, later this month. So anyway, I haven't covered it very much, but I found this article on popular resistance. I was on Clearing the Fog with Margaret Flowers. Popular resistance is one of my go-tos for daily news. And I want to kind of emphasize, I want to emphasize independent media when I share work here and when I cover stories, because I feel like we need to do that, and I think that's a great way to do political education, is by sharing the independent media that is out there and the analysis. I'm much more on the analysis. So I'm not here to go over 7,000 word investigative reports, right? I'm not going to do that here. That would take a long time, just like it would take a really long time to, for example, read Capital with you all, or to read even just a smaller pamphlet like State and Revolution, written by Lenin, right? So this is kind of the way that I am going to try to um, integrate political education here. I'll do my own self-study, and through that process, we can get to a point where we are analyzing the news, we're analyzing developments as they occur, and we're doing so through a perspective, a socialist perspective, a revolutionary anti-imperialist perspective. And so that's what I hope to accomplish here on my solo streams. And so I'm kind of jumping it off today, and there will be fewer stories, but a lot, I hope, really good conversation for you all. I want to talk about an article that was written in the Morning Star, shared on Popular Resistance, re-shared. So the Morning Star is a great left periodical in the UK, and it's about Maduro's success. You don't hear this very often, Maduro's success. Uh, uh, Nicolas Maduro, who has been so maligned by the Western corporate media, the US corporate media, as a dictator, someone who's starving his people, forcing migration, creating economic crisis, right? But Nicolas Maduro, since Hugo Chavez has died, has been maybe the most maligned political leader in Latin America, has been the most targeted leader. I mean, there have been assassination attempts on his life. There have been multiple attempts by the United States to foment guarimbas, or uh, right, these uprisings, these rebellions by the wealthy white oligarch aligned, or just straight oligarch opposition, right? This violent, right? 2014, I think 2007. Right? There was multiple years where Nicolas Maduro's administration, his leadership, was challenged by U.S. funded violence in the country. But yet, Nicolas Maduro remains in as the head of state of Venezuela, has been reelected. And although there were concerns that there was maybe wavering popularity of the Socialist Party of Venezuela, the PSUV, it seems that the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, it seems that the popularity is actually held steady, and that the legitimacy of its leadership has held steady and continues to strengthen. And so this is what this article is about, and I'm going to read it with you. And so I'm going to share the screen and get to the article. So it's called Maduro's Success. So here's the picture. I mean, it's hard to kind of see, it's cut off, but Maduro's Success, Principled Resistance to Imperialism Pays Off, by Francisco Dominguez. So he says that the world has been stunned by a double wonder: Bolivarian Venezuela's political survival and its miraculous economic recovery. The Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean has reported that it expects the Venezuelan economy to grow for the first time since 2014 by 5%. That's pretty significant, one of the highest in the region. Now, Venezuela's economy has, of course, been racked by negative growth for a while, a lot of it due to sanctions, but 5% growth, if we just take year on year, 5% growth is double that of what the United States generally averages at this point in its economic life. So very significant. Venezuela's rate of inflation has come down from something like 10 million%, as reported by CNBC in 2019, and described as, quote, the biggest economic disaster in modern history, end quote, by the Washington Post in the same year, to just 7.1% in September 2021 and an incredible 1.4% in March of 2022. The March 2022 issue of the PSUV magazine, Economía Política y Revolución, reports that corn production, essential for arepas, Venezuela's staple food, very good, I gotta say, has increased by 60%, rice 17%, with an increase of non-oil exports of 76%. These developments are coupled with a strong export performance not only for oil, a sturdy revival of domestic consumption levels, abundance of the supply of all basic necessities, rise in the population's standard of living, gradual and robust reconnection with the world economy, except the US, and a successful battle against the COVID 19 pandemic with one of the best performances in the region and the world, 5,716 deaths, that is 20.1 per 100,000 inhabitants, compared with 304.18 per 100,000 in the United States. I'm just going to comment on this really quick because I was on the Jimmy Dore show right as the pandemic was escalating. I think we were talking about Nancy Pelosi and we were talking about the squad. And I mentioned, right, the pandemic was spreading. I think this was April 2020, I would like to say. And I mentioned how Venezuela was doing a really incredible job with the pandemic already at that point. I don't know if this was April or maybe this was June. I know I was on one of those points, but nonetheless, when I was on, I was talking about how Venezuela was doing and all the investments that they were making, especially on the economic front. Despite sanctions, they were putting into place the resources necessary, the institutions necessary to get people by through food deliveries and by helping people survive economically by giving them the incomes that they needed even if they couldn't work. And this is a country that was so poor. I mean, at that time, the economic situation was still very difficult, much more difficult than it is now. And still, Venezuela was able to do that. And so I said, well, the United States isn't doing this. We should really pause and just think for a second how a sanctioned, maligned country that is literally being plundered by the United States violently can do much better than the United States at containing the COVID-19 pandemic. I think, that point obviously still stands if we look at now, as Mr. Dominguez said, if we look at now just the overall death toll versus the United States of COVID-19, from COVID-19. All this within the context of the vicious U.S. blockade involving over 600 nasty unilateral economic measures. Though Venezuela's economy is recovering, it is still suffering from the consequences of U.S. aggression since it still needs to address and reverse all of the distortions caused by U.S. sanctions. President Nicolas Maduro's confidence in Venezuela's economic recovery is such that he took decisions to condone the $70 million debt to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, reduce half the size of the debt of other member countries of the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean, OCES, and restarted the agreement with the countries affiliated to PetroCaribe with a 35% discount on the price of oil. So here you have Venezuela, right, as a major energy distributor, producer, actually forgiving smaller countries, countries that, arguably have similar poverty, have similar levels in terms of levels of development, but yet despite the sanctions, Venezuela has been generous and has been trying to develop bonds of solidarity and help countries out that are struggling during this very difficult time in the world. So that's very interesting. To reduce this simply to economic confidence, however, will be misplaced as it is driven by Venezuela's revolutionary solidarity, inspired by Hugo Chavez's political and ethical vision, whose tradition President Maduro, leading the PSUV and the Bolivarian Revolution, has maintained. So it has maintained, and that's very important because how many times have you heard from, I don't know, the milk toast left, the latte, whatever left, the pro imperialist left, whoever they are, when Maduro got into power, how many people decided to say that, oh, well, Nicolas Maduro isn't anything like Hugo Chavez? Venezuela is in real trouble. Oh, Nicolas Maduro has been absolutely terrible for the country. You heard this from people that there was a lot of blame placed onto Nicolas Maduro himself, this working class bus driver who literally was carrying forward the Bolivarian tradition, the Bolivarian Revolution, arguably in even more difficult conditions than what Hugo Chavez had to face, especially in the latter period of Hugo Chavez's administration, of his leadership. Nicolas Maduro has had to face the brunt of sanctions, right? These massive sanctions placed on Venezuela almost directly after, not directly after. I was still in college when Hugo Chavez died. But around 2015, that began this onslaught of economic sanctions. And then you add in the non-conventional asymmetric warfare, this proxy war on Venezuela internally, right? The funding of opposition groups, the funding of the racist oligarchic opposition in order to commit violence in the country and instability in the country. And you can see that the situation was very, very difficult, yet nonetheless, Nicolas Maduro has maintained the spirit of the revolution all the way through. None of the above would have been possible without the solid support of the people of Venezuela, especially its productive sectors, namely workers and peasants, not an atomized masses supporting the government, not as atomized masses supporting the government and resisting imperialist aggression, but as conscious and active citizens organized in their class institutions. The resistance to imperialist aggression has strengthened the relationship of the mass organizations of the people, trade unions, peasant bodies, communitarian organizations, women, youth, and so forth within the PSUV. The party's authority has immensely increased, while simultaneously that of the right-wing parties, especially Juan Guaido's wing, has massively weakened. At a December 2021 regional and municipal elections, the PSUV and its allies scored a sweeping victory, winning 20 out of 23 governorships and 213 mayoralities to 120 to various right-wing oppositions. Thus, it begs belief that preposterous and utterly false charges have been made accusing Maduro of leading a right-wing leaning government. The anti-blockade law 2020 of October and the law of special economic zones April 2021 have been used as a battering ram to depict President Maduro as neoliberal. And I got to say, special economic zones, right? Free trade agreements are often used as reasons why China is neoliberal. And I'm sure there's a relationship here. So similar charges have been leveled against the government of Cuba for setting up a special economic zone in Meriel, but also against President Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua for a strategy of the popular economy depicted as a quote-unquote brand of neoliberal developmentism, end quote. Evo Morales has also suffered criticisms as being committed to a neoliberal program based on, quote, fiscal austerity, low inflationary growth, inconsequential agrarian reform, low social spending, and alliances with transnational capital, end quote. The anti-blockade law and the law of special economic zones in Venezuela stipulate the participation of private capital in an unavoidable readjustment of the productive apparatus required to bring about the desperately needed economic recovery. In the context of Venezuela's economy having lost 99% of its revenues because of U.S. sanctions, 99%. That's basically almost a total shutdown of all of Venezuela's revenue. It makes economic sense to draw and harness existing sources of capital, always under the aegis of the Bolivarian state, to generate productive activity, sources of employment, value added, all aimed at improving the population's living standards. However, the positive results mentioned above ought not to be exclusively attributed to these special economic laws, but more importantly, neither the Bolivarian government, President Maduro, or the PSUV at any point since the death of Hugo Chavez have abandoned their commitment to social justice as a central ethic and tenet that guides their politics and actions. In fact, quite the opposite is the case. Imperialist-driven isolation aimed at economic collapse of socialist revolutions is an axiomatic fact of history. Lenin himself was compelled to adopt the new economic policy caused by a catastrophic situation brought about by economic, political, and military aggression of 14 imperialist countries between 1918 and 1921, which, as you all may remember, the United States sent over 10,000 of its own personnel to engage in that invasion of the Soviet Union. So as a consequence of this imperialist aggression toward the Soviet Union, by 1921, the USSR faced famine, huge food queues in the city, caused by acute shortages, a severe decline of energy supplies, multiple peasant revolts, military mutinies, strikes, hyperinflation, black market racketeering, and the collapse of the value of the ruble. With all the contextual, historic, political, and economic limitations of the comparison, Venezuela, subjected to sustained U.S. economic warfare, has confronted a similar situation of potential collapse. At any rate, no truly neoliberal policies anywhere in the world, from the US to Sri Lanka, implemented as an emergency package to deal with severe economic crisis, have ever produced an improvement in any country's economic performance, rise in the standard of living, expansion of the self-organization of the masses of people, workers, peasants, women, youth, pensioners, and the poor in general, and greater political support for the government that implemented them. So this is really important. What he is saying is that neoliberal measures, if these are truly neoliberal measures, have never led to an increase in the standard of living, of political legitimacy, of love and faith and support of any government, right? Neoliberal policies actually generate the opposite. So this is obvious to even the most superficial observers of current affairs in Latin America, who find it difficult to deny that it's neoliberal policies that lie at the heart of the catastrophic failure of domestic oligarchies in Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Honduras, Mexico, Argentina to consolidate their rule, a malaise that is currently hitting the narco state of Colombia with the election upcoming, the second round, which shows that a left candidate could win, and fascist President Bolsonaro in Brazil very hard. As you see, the Workers' Party is coming back up, and Lula da Silva is showing that the Workers' Party may make a resurgence as president of Brazil in the next election. So Joe Biden's desperation to obtain extra sources of oil supplies led him to send a U.S. delegation to talk directly to President Maduro, a government the U.S. does not recognize, on at least two occasions, which have resulted in stronger reassertion of Venezuela's national sovereignty and a massive vindication of Maduro's legitimacy. Thus far, these peculiar encounters have produced a very mild easing of U.S. sanctions, but a strengthening of Caracas's demand for the full lifting of all sanctions and a formal recognition of President Maduro's democratically elected government. Contrast this with Europe's abject submissiveness to Washington's diktats. Nevertheless, Washington remains committed to quote-unquote regime change in Venezuela and continues to recognize the 2015 obsolete National Assembly and Guaido as, quote, the interim president of Venezuela, end quote, both confirmed in an official State Department statement as recently as May of this year. With the strong economic recovery presided over and led by President Maduro's government in the PSUV, the revolution has entered a phase of deepening the transition from a rentier, oil export-based economy to economic diversification and import substitution aimed at continuing the socialist transformation of the state, society, and economy. All these objectives were reaffirmed at the PSUV's 5th National Congress, held with a vibrant atmosphere in March to coincide with the 9th anniversary of Chavez's death. In case there is any remaining doubt about the socialist direction of Bolivarian Venezuela, there are well over 4 million citizens organized in the People's Militia to assuage anybody's misgivings. So this was a great short article, I think, of the overall situation. I really do appreciate how we can just go over, right, the objective reality of what's going on in Venezuela. We can see the stability that has been growing, right? Whenever a country like Venezuela falls out of the news, it's not just because the US is somehow just focusing on Ukraine now, focusing on Russia now. It's generally because that country is more stable and the US machinations are not going so well. US aggression is not going so well. And that is the case in Venezuela. Venezuela has a long way to go, of course, to get to a point where it is growing at the rate that it wants, that it is able to develop the infrastructure and develop and continue to raise the standard of living of the people in the way that it wants. But it is improving. The situation is improving. And I think that speaks to the commitment of the Bolivarian government, of the Bolivarian revolution, of the masses of people who are engaged in it, toward the upliftment and the empowerment of the working class and of the oppressed sections of Venezuela that have historically faced some of the most egregious and worst forms of neoliberal austerity prior to the rise of Hugo Chavez and the PSUV and the Bolivarian Revolution, and then during, when the United States has, as this article said, stripped 99% of Venezuela's revenue from the country. 99%, and yet still Venezuela's government has been able to endure, has been able to adjust. And I think what's really interesting about this adjustment, and I think that this is going to be a pattern throughout the region, especially for those progressive governments, those socialist oriented governments in the region, there is obviously an attention and an eye toward China, because these special economic zones, these anti-blockade laws, right, to free up trade and connectivity with other countries, they really do emulate China's model of reform and opening up. Now, this isn't to say that there's some kind of direct link or that they are exactly the same, because as this article also said, and I agree with this, you can't just make historic and contextual comparisons that don't speak to very key differences in the special conditions within each context. Yes, we're not saying that they are directly the same or that Venezuela is copying China. But nonetheless, there is a deep interest in China's model. And Venezuela and China, and really China and the rest of the region, have become more and more and more close, that the bonds have strengthened, especially in the investment in technology, especially in the assistance that China has been able to provide, and Russia, around the COVID-19 pandemic, with the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America. You just had Nicaragua after the latest election, right? And uh, the Belt and Road countries, right, include Venezuela. 2018, it joined on. So Venezuela is a part of the Belt and Road, and it is seeking, right, to learn from China, as I think the rest of the world should, but especially, um, especially underdeveloped and oppressed nations like Venezuela, which have been under the gun of imperialism. China's model for economic development, to be able to go from an extremely poor, low income country to now a middle to high income country that still remains committed to the objectives of socialism, the ethics and the principles. This is something that I think we can all learn from, but I think especially those countries in the global south that have been plundered, that have been stripped and robbed of their wealth by imperialism. Because what did China do? China was still very poor in the mid 1970s. By 1978, with the announcement of reform and opening up, there was virtually no heavy industry. And why was that? Well, the United States, for more than 2 decades, had essentially imposed a technology embargo, a sanctions on China, which were justified through diplomatic means by failing to acknowledge China, mainland China, the People's Republic of China, as the rightful government of China at the United Nations. But that included all sorts of other embargoes to that country, and the United States' hegemony over the economic order post World War II at that time was arguably a lot stronger than it is now. So China struggled mightily to advance the productive forces, especially in the rural areas. And if you can't advance the productive forces in the rural areas, it's very hard in a majority peasant country. It's very hard to think about how to develop either higher forms of technology and higher forms of production. And that's why, even into the reform and opening up period, the way that the US and Europe and other so-called quote unquote developed countries, imperialist countries, what Bernie Sanders would call, what does he call them, major countries, how they treated China was this like low wage factory, right? That it was tolerable because labor there could be, in the main, super exploited objectively. Not that China was super exploiting them, but that the wage levels and that the standards of living were so low that uh, the United States, and other countries could park their factories there and say, yes, your labor will, of course, bring massive returns to the imperialist world. That's changed a lot because of reform and opening up, because China said, okay, if you do that, if you want our very productive and very low wage labor force, you have to let us in. You have to let us know how to do these things, how to build these means of production. We're going to keep the commanding heights of the economy nationalized. We're going to ensure that all private ventures are joint ventures, which means that Chinese private companies and mainly state-owned companies are in the mix, that you cannot just come here and park your corporation without a joint venture and without there being cooperation with China's sovereign economic development. And that means that the Communist Party was always in command. And that means that the principles of socialism were always in command, even during the period, even during the wild 90s, even when there was all this liberalization in China to a higher degree than what we've seen in the last decade and a half. There was still a commitment to the development path. There was still innovation within the politics of the Communist Party to focus on, right, scientific development, technological development, raising the standards of living. And then when Xi Jinping became president and became the general secretary of the Communist Party of China, things changed a lot. There was a rollback of the corruption, a rollback of some of the consequences of reforming and opening up. And that process continues so that there can be the achievement of common prosperity, so that the alleviation and the eradication of extreme poverty, which has been achieved, doesn't stop there. That the living standards continue to rise, that relative poverty is addressed, that any excesses in the private economy, in the private sector, are rolled back, and that the common objectives of socialism to provide for people's needs and for their wants and for their aspirations are maintained, because China has a goal to become a modern socialist country by 2050. And if it wasn't for that goal, adherence to it, and for reform and opening up, which really unleashed the productive forces within China, you wouldn't have the incredible infrastructure development, the massive investment in renewable energy, and all of the achievements that China has been able to make in high technology, and to be able to distribute those achievements among the people in a way that benefits everybody. You wouldn't have any of that. And now Venezuela and Latin America, they want in. Why wouldn't they want in? Cuba wants in. That's why Cuba and China's partnership through energy and through the Belt and Road Initiative is escalating and enhancing and increasing as well. Latin America wants in to what China has to offer in the model that China provides. During the 20th century, you may remember that a lot of the ways, if you've studied socialism, studied communism, studied the movement, and studied perhaps the Third International, etc., the Soviet Union and then China, and then both of them, right, we're seeing these models for what a proletarian revolution would look like, what it meant for oppressed peoples, oppressed classes, the working class, to take state power and then to administer the country and to administer resources, redistribute wealth, and to ultimately hold the dictatorship of the proletariat over capital, right? That was kind of the model, right? It was like armed struggles took power, right? There was a real emphasis on the ideology and on almost like the purity of Marxism. And I think it was a really intense, really exciting time. Now we're in a different kind of an exciting time, because you have now, unlike China in 1955, 1960, after the Great Leap Forward, and then into the Cultural Revolution, 1960 onward, into reform and opening up. And then the Soviet Union had its own internal problems, and that were also fueled by external aggression. So you had kind of a decline over this period of the innovation of socialism and of the inspiration of it, right? It started to really decline after, arguably in the 1970s, and then, of course, 1980s and onward. But now we're in a different, exciting kind of period, because you have China as this kind of mecca of advanced socialist development. What it means for a country to survive that onslaught and advance the productive forces in a way that show a road to the rest of the world about what it could look like, right? If, for example, countries in the global south can unleash their productive forces, find a way to do that, either get around or alleviate or relieve their economic isolation in the world economy, and then work together, it's possible that all of these countries, right, especially the socialist countries, but even those that are non-socialist or struggling for socialism, right, these countries can uh, uh, unleash their productive forces and begin to walk a similar path within their respective context. And that's very exciting. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative I see as kind of a model for that, what that cooperation, that solidarity will look like through an economic basis, yes. But also, when you look at how the Belt and Road Initiative works, you see that there's a lot of social solidarity there as well. It's not just roads and bridges, and that you're going to have maybe state-of-the-art telecommunications, etc. It's also social sector development, right? Building schools, hospitals, giving countries the capacity, the technical know-how, and the access to a market that can provide those resources, because a lot of countries don't have access to those markets, whether it's because they are systematically uh, placed in a neo-colonial situation where their relationship with the imperialist economies is one of super exploitation, or whether it's through outright sanctions and economic warfare, or both, right? So if you have the situation of both, then it stands to serve that China's example is going to be very motivating, very inspiring, and very important. And so the Belt and Road Initiative is kind of that framework. It's kind of that trajectory. And I'm going to release my speech text soon. And as well, I'll post the video again. It's on YouTube already. But I'll post a video, and then I'll post a video of the whole talk as well on Substack. I'll try to get to that tomorrow or this weekend, early this weekend. So there you have it. Latin America wants into what China has to offer to the Belt and Road Initiative and to this model, right? Don't let any socialist or communist, I don't care who they are, don't let any of them tell you that a sovereign socialist government doesn't have the right to use any means at its disposal to not just survive, but to advance the level of productive forces and the standard of living of its people and of the world. Even if that means that you're going to have private capital be managed under the supervision and under the diktats of the socialist state. Don't let anyone tell you that that is incongruent with socialism, because Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, Mao Zedong, none of them rejected this premise. None of them. All of them understood that socialism comes with the birth pains of the old order, and that those issues, those contradictions must be resolved in a logical manner, in a manner that, while the revolution is not something that happens, in steps, it's not a reform process, it's what happens after the revolution that is a step-by-step process that has ultimately as its aim the bringing about of communism, which does not happen as subsequent revolutions. It happens through enforcing policies and strengthening the economy, the society, the government, strengthening it in a way that meets the objectives, meets the development goals, and ultimately gets us closer to a society in a world that does not have classes. And so that's where the path that China is on. And it's no surprise that any government, even governments that aren't socialist oriented, that has experienced the underdevelopment, the neo-colonial plunder, and the poverty that imperialism has subjected onto much of the world, it's not surprised that these countries want in. It's not surprised that even countries like Greece and Portugal want in, right? Because even these countries, despite their role in the European Anglo imperialist world order over centuries, right? Well, that's 500 plus years. Despite that, these countries have been subjected to horrific austerity measures and have, some people call it, I don't say it's been colonized because I think colonialism always has a racial component. I don't see that. But there is an economic subjection, right? An economic subservience that has been developed, suppression and oppression of countries even like Spain, Portugal, Greece, where they are like the lower tier of the European Anglo imperialist order, and they are subjective to the harshest consequences and conditions of neoliberalism. So it's not a surprise that they would look at China and say, okay, at least we get a break in some respects. We can build a port here. We can do, we can increase trade there. We don't have to always deal with the conditions. That's exactly what China is bringing about. In Latin America, Venezuela is one of the biggest examples of this, is saying, yeah, we can emulate that model for ourselves and we can strengthen ties with China. So in any event, I'm going to conclude. That's all for the stories. Like the stream. I'm going to stay on. It's about 1:30. I can stay on for about 5-10 more minutes. Like the stream. Hit that subscribe button. hit the notifications bell. Some people are saying they're not getting any notifications. I may come out with a poll to see whether people are getting notifications or not. Maybe I'll put that in the community. But I know that a lot of people don't get them. But still hit that notifications bell. See if the notifications are coming. If they don't, please do pay attention to social media, best you can. I understand it's not always easy. And then, of course, the month of May was really difficult. I think it was something like 20, 30, 40 subscribers, somewhere between 20, 25 and 40 subscribers had to leave. And ultimately, that puts me back a lot in my overall goal for 2022 to be able to stop asking for further subscriptions. But nonetheless, I'm about, I don't know, $225 or so now away from my goal. So please do subscribe to my Patreon. Best way to support all of the work, the articles, the streams, and everything I do, everything else I do, Friends of Socialist China, etc. Please do support me if you're able. So last thing, I want to promote an event that I'm doing, and then please do, as you're listening to me, please do, if you have any questions, or if you posted a question above in the chat, repost it, whatever it may be. I think there was one super chat. I'll just thank you really quick before I get there. Jeez, chat's been very active. Thanks, guys. Usually it's at the top. Oh, no. Okay. So, yeah, there's a super sticker by Elisa. Thank you so much for the euros. Appreciate that. I don't think there was any other super chats here. No, I don't see them. Okay. So, with that said, everyone, go to the description. You can look on with me. While you're there, of course, save the Patreon link if you're going to subscribe and all of that good stuff. There's other options as well. If you like Substack annual, please do. So, with that said, though, here is an event. The link is in the description. I'm going to be speaking at it June 11th, so a little less than a week. I want you all to register for this event. I want you all to share it if you're able. The Empire Strikes Back, Imperialism's Global War on Multipolarity, organized by Friends of Socialist China, which I co-edit. And it's going to be on Saturday, the 11th of June, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, sorry to those Pacific peeps, 4 p.m. British time, and then 11 p.m. China time. So we're going to talk about the latest developments in international politics, particularly around NATO AUKUS, the war on Ukraine, and the increasing militarization of the U.S.-led new Cold War. The topics will include prospects for sovereign development in the global south, NATO's plan for Ukraine and how this impacts China, the Solomon Islands, and the West plan for hegemony in the Pacific, the Biden administration's undermining of the One China principle, the evolving China-Russia relationship and the West's response, and then the NATO AUKUS and military infrastructure of the new Cold War. So confirmed speakers, they're quite amazing and incredible. So you definitely want to hear them speak. Victor Gao, who's the vice president of the Center for China and Globalization. He's great, very, very entertaining, and just an incredibly smart person. You all know Ben Norton over at Multipolarista, a Li Jingjing, good friend of the program. Jenny Clegg, who's also an incredible thinker, author, and activist, who's wrote a whole book about multipolarity. And I am going to be speaking at this. We're going to have Chris Matalko of the South African Communist Party. He's the second deputy to the General Secretary. We're going to have Mustafa Haider Said, Executive Director of Pakistan China Institute. We're going to have Professor Ding Yin Fan, Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute in China, recommended by the International Department of the CPC, which we do have a relationship with them. They are actually quite good to work with and quite interesting. So they always want to build ties. And I, for one, not scared of the whole agent of the CCP thing. This is all fraternal, man. This is all fraternal love. They see our organization as one, as our platform as one that's very valuable, and we're happy to, build bonds with the International Department of the Communist Party of China. So Ju Hyun Park, the writer and organizer for No Duntal for the Korean Community Development. That's a great organization, No Duntal. Rob Kajiwara, who's the president for Peace for Okinawa Coalition. Definitely want to have him on this program at some point soon. He is an incredible anti-war activist, anti-imperialist activist who is at the forefront of the peace struggle and the anti-imperialist struggle in Okinawa. Sarah Flounders, who I've worked with over the years. She's the head of the United National Anti-War Coalition, International Action Center. Yuri Tavrovsky, the chairman for the Russian-Chinese Committee for Friendship, Peace, and Development. And then the great Radhika Desai, who I've had on the show, who will be the convener. She's generally our moderator. She is great, and we appreciate her very much. So she is part of the International Manifesto Group, Geopolitical and Economy Research Group, and she will be convening the event, giving opening remarks, and probably doing a bit of moderating as well. So you want to come to this, even if you're zoomed out, you want to register, you want to watch it, you want to keep it on in the background, you want to highlight your favorite speeches, your favorite talks, use them in political education spaces. Usually at events like these, we do try to do preparations and make sure that the talks are both concise but also informative and helpful. So definitely do register. So you can do that here on Eventbrite. The button is there in the link in the description. So please do register. So that's it for that. But definitely register for the event. We want to see a good turnout. We want to make sure that people are plugged in to Friends of Socialist China, that they're aware of our work, and that we're continuing to strengthen and grow that platform. So with that said, any other questions or anything like that before I head out? Thank you so much. I appreciate you all coming. I can stay on probably for another 5 minutes. If you have any questions, anything at all, please do ask it now, and I can try to do so. So try to answer some. But yeah, no, I think, this is kind of how I want to do things here. you know, sorry for those who can't make it during work. My schedule has changed a lot. I tend to be, I'm trying to be better about just life balance, and so and also, what I've noticed is that when I do streams later in the evening, so I apologize to all those who would rather have it after work times, but I noticed that a lot of people are just going to uh, bigger platforms, right? And that's understandable to some degree because I haven't been doing this for that long. But at the same time, it's like I can't, like I hate when I see half of the viewers I have on now usually, right? That's what I'll average, and that's really, I mean, that's really annoying. But thank you so much, Felix, for the super sticker. I really appreciate that. Um, and did we talk about Pillsbury BDS? What's going on? I don't think we did. I mean, I think that's a joke, but please do. Please do elaborate. If that's a criticism of BDS. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, so I'm trying to have a little bit of better work-life balance. I'm not trying to like my wife works during the day, so I do come on generally on her work days because we live in a New York City apartment, and while there are times where it is okay, especially when I have a guest on and I'm working around a guest schedule, when it's just myself, I try not to interfere with the home life like too much, because I think that creates a dynamic where it's like this becomes something that's more important. So, there are a lot of streamers out there, a lot of people on YouTube that just are just doing this for hours on end, and they can invest basically a full-time schedule to it. But that's not really, unfortunately, can't be me, partly because it's a choice. I need um I need to you know I need to do columns, I need to do other things. I work part-time as well. So anyway, Oh, BDS victory at Pillsbury. Okay. Yeah, no, I didn't understand. Let's see. I want to get, let me see. So no joke, there's been a victory. Oh, great. Did you hear General Mills has sold its stake in an Israeli subsidiary that manufactured Pillsbury products in an illegal settlement? All right. Good. BDS movement, for whatever criticisms Chomsky and even Finkelstein has of it, gotta say that it's still an asset in my opinion, right? I don't know. Like I can criticize almost anything ideologically and almost anything in terms of its core end goal, but it seems like it's an asset and that it does do good things and that even victories that may not seem like immense materially in terms of their impact, they do have an impact. So thanks for that update. Where says, did you hear about BTS appearing at the White House to speak against anti-Asian hate on May 31st? They spoke on the podium with the press secretary and with Biden in the Oval Office. BTS. Maybe I'm just slow today, but could you spell out what BTS is? Just so I know. Maybe I'm just not getting the acronym. I did not hear about that. Uh, so yeah. Thanks, Big Teal. Do what you can. Do what works, says Lewis. Thank you so much. Um, yeah. Okay. So Big Teal really likes the reading out loud thing. Yeah, that's best with shorter works because what ended up happening if I did, longer, especially, man, our favorite communist thinkers, they don't really write short articles. So if I were to have done that, oh, K-pop, okay. Anyway, so no, I've not heard that, but eesh, K-pop, lots of contradictions there. But yeah, so that's interesting about K-pop. A K-pop artist, I'm sure they're very famous. I don't follow the K-pop phenomenon. Speak about anti-Asian hate on May 31st. No. Well, that seems like overall kind of like this strategy of trying to be more in alliance with with Asia Pacific, and anti-Asian racism at this point, when it's a liberal talking point, seems to just be all about, right, how to kind of morally grandstand in the larger geopolitical game against China because as you all know, you can't fight anti-Asian racism while also waging a new Cold War on China. It's not feasible. It doesn't work. And so yeah, no, thanks for that information. Um, so I don't know if there's anything else here. Thank you for telling me that BTS is a K-pop group. Sorry for not knowing about that. I'm still out here listening to like independent hip hop, some of which would be considered outdated in some circles, especially to my generation Z folks. So I am very out of the loop when it comes to K-pop and always have been. And so thanks for registering, Loa Socialisti. Appreciate that. Appreciate you coming back to the stream. I don't see any more questions though, and I do have to go. I'm pushing it. I'm really pushing it here. So on my way out, please do like that stream, like the video. Make sure that you're hitting the subscription button, right? Subscribe. Then hit that notifications bell directly afterward. And then if you're able, subscribe to my Patreon to support this work. Patreon.com/Dhaiphong. Do so at whatever amount. There's other options also in the description. And that will help me hopefully recover from this difficult month of May, this last month of May. I think the economic crisis is getting worse and worse. And so I can expect it to also, hit me in this area, not to mention in other areas. I've seen in my I'm a part-time therapist, seen in that work where there's a lot of concern about cost, and there's also a lot of fear, and there's also just a lot of trauma now with the mass shootings and the war and a lot of things going on for people. And so Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate all the support. I appreciate all the people here who come loyally to these streams. I know that it's a challenge to build up a viewership here now these days, and so I appreciate it nonetheless. And I hope that as I kind of recover from this like phase of burnout, that I can start to engage in some of these alternative platforms. But nonetheless, it's really, it's a big time management thing. And I think I, like all of you, like the rest of the workers, the rest of those that are exploited by capitalism, we also need to just take time. We need to have that time, and that time is constantly encroached upon. So with that said, though, peace out, everyone. Take care. Salute. And I will be back soon, perhaps this weekend. All right. Take good care. Peace out.